Sarah Chen nervously wheeled herself through the wide hallways of Riverside High School on the first day of her freshman year. The 14-year-old girl had spent most of her summer worrying about this moment. Middle school had been familiar territory, but high school felt like entering an entirely different world. Her mother, Mrs. Chen, had dropped her off early to help her get familiar with the building's layout. "Remember, sweetheart," she had said, "you're just as capable as anyone else." Sarah held on to those words as she navigated through groups of students who seemed impossibly tall and confident. Sarah was born with cerebral palsy, which affected her ability to walk and sometimes made her speech slightly slower than others. But her mind was sharp, and she had always maintained excellent grades despite the physical challenges she faced daily. Her wheelchair had become an extension of herself, a bright blue motorized chair that gave her independence. The school hallways were already filling up with students. Some cast curious glances her way, while others seemed too absorbed in their own first-day anxieties to notice her. Sarah consulted the schedule she had carefully tucked into her backpack. First period, English with Ms. Reynolds in room 203. Finding the elevator took longer than expected. When she finally reached the second floor, Sarah realized she only had 5 minutes until the bell. Her heart started beating faster as she searched for room 203. The numbered rooms seemed to jump around illogically. 206, 204, 207. Just when panic started to set in, she spotted 203 at the end of the hallway. As Sarah entered the classroom, most seats were already taken. She noticed an empty space at the front of the room, clearly left open for her wheelchair. At least the school had thought about that. The bell rang just as she positioned herself at the desk. Ms. Reynolds walked in moments later. She was a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a pressed blouse and pencil skirt. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she walked to her desk. Sarah noticed how the teacher's eyes lingered on her wheelchair for a moment too long, and something in her expression made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Welcome to Freshman English," Ms. Reynolds announced, her voice carrying across the room. "I expect excellence in this class. No exceptions, no excuses." Her gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Sarah again. As Ms. Reynolds began taking attendance, Sarah observed her classmates. Most looked as nervous as she felt. A boy 2 seats away caught her eye and offered a friendly smile. The name tag on his desk read Michael Torres. He had kind eyes and didn't stare at her wheelchair like some others did. The first assignment came quickly, a writing exercise about summer experiences. Ms. Reynolds handed out paper and instructed everyone to write for 15 minutes. Sarah pulled out her laptop, which she used for writing due to difficulty holding a pen. The clicking of her keyboard seemed unusually loud in the quiet classroom. "I prefer handwritten work," Ms. Reynolds said loudly, standing over Sarah's desk. "It shows more effort and thoughtfulness." Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm. "I have an accommodation plan," she explained softly. "It allows me to use my laptop for writing assignments." Ms. Reynolds' lips tightened into a thin line. "Very well," she said, her tone making it clear she wasn't pleased. "But I expect your work to be twice as good to make up for it." Several students looked uncomfortable at this exchange, including Michael, who frowned at the teacher's back as she walked away. Sarah focused on her screen, trying to ignore the burning in her eyes. She had known high school wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected challenges like this on the very first day. Still, Sarah began typing about her summer volunteering at the local library's children's program. She wrote about reading stories to kids who didn't care that her words sometimes came out slower than others. She wrote about their smiles and enthusiasm and how they often asked to ride on her cool blue racing chair. As the class continued, Sarah noticed Ms. Reynolds watching her with an expression that mixed disapproval and something else, perhaps resentment. But Sarah remembered her mother's words and sat up straighter in her chair. She had faced challenges before and had always persevered. This would be no different. When the bell finally rang, Sarah gathered her things slowly, allowing other students to leave first. As she headed toward the door, she heard Ms. Reynolds mutter something under her breath. She couldn't make out the words. The tone was clear enough. This was just the beginning of what promised to be a very long semester. As the first week of school progressed, Sarah quickly realized that Ms. Reynolds' behavior on the first day wasn't just a bad first impression. The English teacher seemed determined to make every class a challenge for her, far beyond the usual academic expectations. On Wednesday, Ms. Reynolds announced a group reading exercise. Each student would take turns reading passages from To Kill a Mockingbird aloud. When it came to Sarah's turn, she began reading carefully, taking her time to pronounce each word clearly despite her occasional speech difficulty. "We don't have all day," Ms. Reynolds interrupted after just 2 sentences. "Perhaps someone else should take over." She pointed to another student before Sarah could even respond. The classroom fell uncomfortably silent, and Sarah felt her face burn with humiliation. During Thursday's class, Ms. Reynolds handed back their summer experience essays. Sarah had spent extra time on hers, making sure every sentence was perfect. When she opened the document, her heart sank. A large red C was marked at the top, along with a note that read, "Using a computer doesn't excuse poor writing." Sarah couldn't understand it. She had always received A's on her writing assignments in middle school. She read through Ms. Reynolds' comments, which seemed more focused on criticizing her use of a laptop than the actual content of her essay. Michael Torres, who sat nearby, leaned over slightly. "Hey," he whispered, "what did you get?" When Sarah hesitantly showed him her grade, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "That's crazy. I read your essay when you were typing it. It was really good." Before they could talk more, Ms. Reynolds' sharp voice cut through the air. "Miss Chen, Mr. Torres, this is not social hour. Sarah, move your wheelchair back from Michael's desk. You're disrupting his learning space." Sarah hadn't even realized she had drifted slightly closer while they were whispering. She quickly adjusted her position, but Ms. Reynolds wasn't finished. "In fact, that wheelchair takes up too much space in the front row. From tomorrow, you'll sit at the back of the class." "But I need to be closer to see the board clearly," Sarah protested quietly. Ms. Reynolds crossed her arms. "Well, you should have thought about that before choosing to disrupt my class. Back row tomorrow, or you'll be marked absent." Several students exchanged worried glances. Michael opened his mouth to say something, but Sarah caught his eye and slightly shook her head. She didn't want to make things worse. Later that day, Sarah wheeled herself into the girls' bathroom during lunch break, fighting back tears. As she tried to compose herself, she heard 2 girls enter, talking about what had happened in English class. "Did you see how Ms. Reynolds treated Sarah?" One girl said, "It's getting worse every day." "I know," the other replied. "Yesterday she called Sarah a disruption to the learning environment, just for asking a question about the homework. My mom's a teacher at another school, and she says that's discrimination." "Someone should report her," the first girl said. "But Ms. Reynolds has been here forever, and everyone's scared of her." Sarah waited until they left before emerging from the bathroom stall. Her hands were shaking as she washed them. She thought about telling her parents, but she didn't want them to worry. They had been so excited about her starting high school, and her mother was already stressed about her new job. The next day, Sarah arrived early to class and positioned her wheelchair in the back row as instructed. From this distance, the words on the whiteboard were blurry, and she could barely hear Ms. Reynolds over the classroom chatter. When she raised her hand to ask about an assignment detail she couldn't see clearly, Ms. Reynolds ignored her completely. "Freak," Sarah heard the teacher mutter while walking past her desk later in the class. The word was spoken softly, but loud enough for several nearby students to hear. Michael Torres, who had asked to move to the back row as well, stiffened in his seat. Sarah gripped the arms of her wheelchair tightly, forcing herself to stay calm. She had faced bullying before, but never from a teacher. As she struggled to take notes on a lesson she could barely see or hear, she wondered how much longer she could handle this treatment. What Sarah didn't notice was the way Michael Torres watched the entire situation with growing anger, or how he was quietly recording Ms. Reynolds' behavior on his phone under his desk. Things were about to change, though Sarah didn't know it yet. The following week brought a major project announcement in English class. Ms. Reynolds explained that each student would give a 5-minute presentation about a personal hero. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. She loved the topic but dreaded speaking in front of the class, especially with Ms. Reynolds watching. "Presentations will begin next Monday," Ms. Reynolds announced, then added with a pointed look toward Sarah, "and I expect everyone to speak clearly and at a normal pace. We can't waste class time with delays." Sarah spent the weekend preparing her presentation about Temple Grandin, the famous scientist and autism advocate who overcame barriers to achieve great things. She practiced repeatedly in front of her mirror, working hard on her pronunciation and timing. When Monday arrived, Sarah's name was called first. She carefully maneuvered her wheelchair to the front of the class, connected her laptop to the projector, and began her presentation. She spoke slowly but clearly, just as she had practiced. Less than a minute into her speech, Miss Reynolds started tapping her pen loudly on her desk. "Pick up the pace, Miss Chen," she interrupted. "This isn't a special education class." Several students gasped quietly. Sarah tried to continue, her voice shaking slightly. She managed to get through another paragraph before Ms. Reynolds stood up. "This is painful to watch," the teacher declared. "You're making everyone uncomfortable with your condition. Just send me the written version and sit down." Sarah's vision blurred with tears as scattered whispers filled the room. She struggled to disconnect her laptop with trembling hands. Behind her, she could hear Ms. Reynolds speaking to the class. "Let this be a lesson in preparation and proper public speaking. Some people simply aren't cut out for regular classroom activities. Perhaps." "Stop it," a sharp voice cut through the classroom. Sarah turned to see Michael Torres standing up, his face red with anger. "You can't treat her like this." "Sit down, Mr. Torres," Ms. Reynolds snapped. "This doesn't concern you." "Yes, it does." Michael's phone was in his hand now. "I've been recording how you treat Sarah, calling her a freak, making her sit in the back where she can't see, embarrassing her in front of everyone. It's all here." The classroom erupted in chatter. Some students pulled out their own phones, playing back recordings and showing them to others. Sarah realized that more people had been paying attention to her situation than she'd known. Ms. Reynolds' face turned pale, then red. "Phones are not allowed in class. Everyone put them away, or you'll all receive failing grades." "Go ahead," Michael challenged. "Give us all Fs, then we can show the principal why. I'm sure he'd love to hear how you discriminate against students with disabilities." Another student, Emma Parker, stood up. "I have recordings too, and screenshots of the unfair grades you've been giving Sarah." "My mom's on the school board," added Jason Chen, no relation to Sarah. "She'd definitely want to know about this." Ms. Reynolds looked around the classroom, seemingly realizing she had lost control of the situation. Her usual confident demeanor cracked as more students began speaking up. Sarah's presentation was fine. "You're the one making us uncomfortable, not her. We should all go to the principal right now." The teacher's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Everyone be quiet," she shouted. "Miss Chen, your disruptive presence has turned my classroom into chaos. Get out! Get out right now." Sarah sat frozen in her wheelchair, torn between humiliation and astonishment at how quickly everything had escalated. But before she could move, Michael stepped forward, positioning himself between her and Ms. Reynolds. "Sarah's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "But you might be, once everyone sees these videos." The bell rang at that moment, shattering the tension. As students began gathering their things, many paused to pat Sarah's shoulder or offer words of support. Ms. Reynolds stood rigid behind her desk, watching as her class united against her. Michael helped Sarah pack up her laptop. "We're going to the principal's office," he told her quietly. "Right now. No more waiting, no more suffering in silence. This ends today." Sarah looked up at him, then at the other students gathering around her supportively. For the first time in weeks, she felt strength rather than shame. She nodded, straightened her shoulders, and turned her wheelchair toward the door. Behind them, Ms. Reynolds remained at her desk, her carefully maintained control finally shattered, as her years of discriminatory behavior were about to catch up with her. The walk to Principal Garcia's office felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. Michael walked beside her wheelchair, while Emma, Jason, and several other students followed behind, their phones containing evidence clutched in their hands. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked quietly, her hands trembling slightly on her wheelchair controls. Michael nodded firmly. "My sister Sophia has autism. I've watched her deal with people like Ms. Reynolds all her life. I should have spoken up sooner." He paused, then added, "Actually, there's something I need to tell you about why I started recording everything." Before he could continue, they reached the principal's office. "Mrs. Martinez, the school secretary, looked up in surprise at the group of students gathering outside her desk. "We need to see Principal Garcia," Michael said. "It's urgent. It's about Ms. Reynolds discriminating against a student." Mrs. Martinez's eyes widened as she looked at the serious faces before her. After a quick phone call, she nodded. "He'll see you now." Principal Garcia was a man in his early 50s with kind eyes and gray temples. He stood up when the students entered, his expression concerned as he noticed their solemn faces. "What's going on?" he asked, clearing space for Sarah's wheelchair near his desk. Michael spoke first, his voice steady. "We need to show you something, sir." He placed his phone on the principal's desk and played the first video. The room filled with Ms. Reynolds' sharp voice calling Sarah a freak. More students stepped forward, sharing their recordings and screenshots. Emma showed the unfairly graded essays, while Jason played a video of Ms. Reynolds forcing Sarah to sit at the back of the classroom. Principal Garcia's face grew increasingly grave as he watched and listened. He took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When the last piece of evidence had been presented, he turned to Sarah. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked gently. Sarah stared at her hands folded in her lap. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Ms. Reynolds said nobody would believe me because she's been teaching here for so long. And," she hesitated, "I didn't want to be seen as causing trouble." "You're not the one causing trouble," Principal Garcia assured her. He looked at Michael. "Tell me more about how this documentation started." Michael shifted in his chair. 3 weeks ago, I was staying late for basketball practice when I saw Ms. Reynolds at a meeting with another teacher. She was complaining about having to deal with that wheelchair girl in her class. She said. He glanced apologetically at Sarah. She said having disabled students was bringing down the school's standards. Sarah felt her chest tighten at these words, but Michael wasn't finished. "That's when I thought about my sister Sophia and how she faces this kind of prejudice. I started paying more attention in class, recording things on my phone. Other students noticed and started doing the same." Principal Garcia nodded slowly. "You did the right thing bringing this to me. This kind of discrimination has no place in our school." He pressed his intercom button. "Mrs. Martinez, please call Ms. Reynolds to my office immediately. And contact Mrs. Chen. We need Sarah's mother here as soon as possible." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Ms. Reynolds arrived, her face turning ashen as she watched the videos. She attempted to defend herself, claiming her words had been taken out of context, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's mother rushed in, moving immediately to her daughter's side. Her face showed a mix of anger and pain as she learned what had been happening. "I want to press charges," Mrs. Chen declared, holding Sarah's hand tightly. "This is a violation of my daughter's rights." Principal Garcia assured them that immediate action would be taken. Ms. Reynolds was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation and would not be returning to the classroom. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt drained but somehow lighter. The burden she'd been carrying for weeks had finally been lifted. Outside the office, her classmates waited, offering words of support and encouragement. Michael hung back until the others had left. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner about what I heard that day after basketball practice," he said. "I wanted to gather enough evidence first to make sure she couldn't deny it." Sarah looked up at him, managing a small smile. "You stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself. Thank you." As they left the office area together, Sarah realized that while this chapter was ending, another was just beginning. The hallway ahead no longer seemed as frightening as it had that morning. For the first time since school started, she felt truly seen and supported, ready to face whatever came next. The day after the confrontation in Principal Garcia's office brought significant changes to Riverside High School. The morning announcements included a special assembly call for all freshman students. As Sarah wheeled into the auditorium, she noticed many students smiling and waving at her, quite different from the hesitant glances she used to receive. Principal Garcia stood at the podium, his expression serious as he addressed the gathered students. Without naming names, he spoke about respect, dignity, and the school's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Sarah sat in the wheelchair-accessible space in the front row, trying not to shrink under the occasional glances cast her way. "One of your classmates showed remarkable courage yesterday," Principal Garcia said, "not just in standing up for themselves, but in trusting our school system to do the right thing. And I want to acknowledge the students who stepped forward as allies. This is what real leadership looks like. After the assembly, Sarah's English class met in their usual room, but with a substitute teacher named Mrs. Adams. The atmosphere felt lighter, though Sarah noticed some students looked uncomfortable, perhaps feeling guilty about not speaking up sooner. Mrs. Adams started the class with a warm smile. I understand we were in the middle of personal hero presentations. Sarah, would you like to finish yours? Sarah hesitated, memories of her last attempt still fresh in her mind. But then she felt a gentle tap on her wheelchair. Michael had rolled up a piece of paper and tossed it onto her lap. Opening it, she read, "You've got this. We're all with you." Taking a deep breath, Sarah wheeled to the front of the classroom. This time, when she began speaking about Temple Grandin, her voice was stronger. No one interrupted. No one tapped pens impatiently. Instead, her classmates listened intently as she described how Temple Grandin had overcome barriers and changed people's perceptions. When she finished, the class erupted in genuine applause. Mrs. Adams wiped a tear from her eye. "That was beautiful, Sarah. Thank you for sharing that with us." During lunch break, something unexpected happened. A group of seniors approached Sarah's table where she sat with Michael and a few other classmates. Their leader was Jamie Rodriguez, the student body president. "We heard what happened with Ms. Reynolds," Jamie said, sitting down across from Sarah. "The senior class wants to do something about it. We're planning a school-wide awareness campaign about disability rights. Would you be interested in helping us organize it?" Sarah looked surprised. "Me?" "Of course." Jamie smiled. "Your story has already inspired a lot of people. Some students from other classes have come forward with similar experiences. We want to make sure nothing like this happens again." Michael spoke up enthusiastically. "That's a great idea. Sarah, you could share your story, and I could talk about my sister's experiences too." As they discussed possibilities, more students gathered around their table. Someone suggested making posters, another proposed a social media campaign. The energy was infectious, and Sarah found herself getting excited about the possibilities. "We could call it Riverside United," suggested Emma, who had joined the group. "Show that we stand together against discrimination of any kind." Sarah looked around at all these people who had become not just allies but friends. A month ago, she had felt isolated and afraid. Now, she was at the center of a movement for positive change in her school. Later that afternoon, as Sarah waited for her mother to pick her up, Michael joined her in the school lobby. "You know what's funny?" he said, leaning against the wall. "Ms. Reynolds wanted to teach us about heroes in literature, but she ended up helping us find the hero in ourselves instead." Sarah smiled, thinking about how much had changed. "I never thought I could stand up to someone like her. I was too scared." "Sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared," Michael replied. "It means doing the right thing even when you are scared." Through the lobby windows, Sarah could see students putting up the first posters for their awareness campaign. The artwork showed different kinds of students together, including one in a wheelchair, with the words "Riverside United" standing together in bold letters. As her mother's car pulled up outside, Sarah felt a new sense of purpose. What had started as one teacher's discrimination had transformed into an opportunity for real change. She wasn't just the girl in the wheelchair anymore. She was Sarah Chen, who helped make her school a better place for everyone. And that, she realized, was a story worth telling. The investigation into Ms. Reynolds' conduct moved quickly. 1 week after the incident, Sarah and her mother sat in a conference room with Principal Garcia, the school district superintendent, and 2 members of the school board. The atmosphere was tense as they reviewed the evidence. "These recordings are deeply disturbing," Superintendent Williams said, removing her glasses. "And unfortunately, after investigating further, we've discovered this isn't an isolated incident. Former students have begun coming forward with similar stories." Sarah listened as they explained how Ms. Reynolds had a history of discriminatory behavior that had gone unreported or been dismissed over the years. Some former students, now adults, had written letters describing their experiences after hearing about Sarah's case through their younger siblings. "We failed these students," one of the school board members admitted. "But thanks to your bravery, Sarah, we can make sure it doesn't happen again." The meeting continued with discussions about new policies, The school would implement mandatory sensitivity training for all staff members. They would also establish a confidential reporting system for students to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. As they left the meeting, Sarah's mother squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You've started something important here." Back in the hallways, Sarah noticed how different things felt. Students she'd never spoken to before stopped to chat. Teachers made a point of checking in with her, ensuring she had everything she needed. The change was dramatic, almost overwhelming. The Riverside United campaign was in full swing. Posters covered the walls, and students wore buttons with the campaign logo. Michael and the student council had organized a series of speakers, including Sarah's physical therapist and Michael's sister Sophia, to talk about living with disabilities. During lunch that day, Jamie Rodriguez approached their table with exciting news. "The local newspaper wants to do a story about our campaign," she announced. "They're especially interested in interviewing Sarah." Sarah nearly choked on her sandwich. "Me, but I'm not good at interviews." "You don't give yourself enough credit," Michael said. "Besides, your story is what started all this. People need to hear it." The next day, a reporter named Ms. Thompson came to the school. She sat with Sarah in the library, asking questions about what had happened with Ms. Reynolds and how it led to the awareness campaign. "What would you say to other students facing discrimination?" Ms. Thompson asked. Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I tell them they're not alone, even if it feels that way. And that speaking up is scary, but staying silent is scarier. Change happens when we find the courage to tell our stories." As the interview concluded, Principal Garcia appeared with more news. The school board had made their decision regarding Ms. Reynolds. She would not be returning to Riverside High School, and the incident would be reported to the State Education Board. "There's something else," Principal Garcia added. "We're creating a new student advisory committee on inclusion and accessibility. Sarah, we'd like you to be its first chairperson." Sarah was stunned. "But I'm just a freshman." "You're a freshman who helped change our entire school culture," he replied. "Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who never planned to be leaders at all." That evening, as Sarah worked on her homework, she received a text from Michael with a link to the newspaper's website. The article about their campaign was already online. The headline read, "Students' Courage Sparks Change. Riverside High School Takes Stand Against Discrimination." Sarah read the article with mixed emotions. There was her story, laid out for everyone to see. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It had become something bigger. A movement for change that went beyond one student or one teacher. Her phone buzzed with messages from classmates who had read the article. Even students from other schools were reaching out through social media, sharing similar experiences and asking how they could start their own awareness campaigns. As she responded to the messages, Sarah thought about how different things were from that first day of school. She had entered Riverside High School feeling vulnerable and afraid. Now, she was helping lead a movement for change. Her mother knocked on her bedroom door. "Everything okay, sweetie? You've been very quiet." Sarah smiled, gesturing to her phone and the flood of supportive messages. "Everything's different now, Mom, but different in a good way." And it was true. What had started as one teacher's discrimination had transformed into an opportunity for real change, not just for Sarah, but for students everywhere who needed their voices to be heard. The newspaper article about Riverside High School's transformation spread quickly through social media. Within days, Sarah began receiving emails and messages from students at other schools, sharing their own stories and asking for advice about starting similar campaigns. One morning, Principal Garcia called Sarah and Michael to his office. They found Jamie Rodriguez and several other student council members already there, along with representatives from 3 neighboring high schools. "Your story has inspired others," Principal Garcia explained. "These schools want to implement their own inclusion programs. They're hoping you'll help guide them." Sarah looked around the room, still amazed by how far things had come. "Of course we'll help," she said. "But I think we need to do more than just share our experience. We should create a network of student advocates." The idea took off immediately. The students spent their lunch periods video conferencing with other schools, sharing resources, and helping them develop their own united campaigns. Michael created a website where schools could share their progress and support each other. During one of these meetings, Sarah received unexpected news. A local TV station wanted to feature Riverside High School's story in a special report about positive changes in education. The reporter, Ms. Martinez, arrived with a camera crew one sunny morning. What makes this story special, Ms. Martinez explained during the interview, is how one student's courage sparked a movement that's spreading across the state. The camera followed Sarah through a typical school day, capturing how different the atmosphere was now. Students of all abilities worked together in classes, ate lunch together, and participated in new inclusive activities that had been established. The biggest surprise came when they filmed the newly formed Student Advisory Committee on Inclusion meeting. Sarah, as chairperson, was leading a discussion about making school events more accessible when a special guest arrived. Dr. Temple Grandin herself had seen the newspaper article and arranged to visit the school. Sarah, who had given a presentation about her just weeks ago, could hardly believe it. "Young people like you are changing the world," Dr. Grandin told the committee. "You're showing that different abilities don't mean different worth." That afternoon, Dr. Grandin gave a speech to the entire school. She talked about her own experiences with discrimination and the importance of standing up for what's right. Sarah sat in the front row, tears in her eyes as she listened to her hero speak. After the speech, Dr. Grandin spent time talking with Sarah and the other student leaders. "Your campaign isn't just about disability rights," she observed. "It's about creating a world where everyone belongs." The TV special aired the following week. Sarah watched it with her family, Michael's family, and several other students who had been part of the movement from the beginning. The report showed how one incident of discrimination had led to positive change that was now spreading to other schools. "That's my brave girl," Sarah's mother said proudly, wiping tears from her eyes as they watched. The next day at school, Sarah noticed something different. Students from the special education department, who had often kept to themselves, were sitting with other students at lunch. Athletes were helping students with mobility issues navigate the hallways. The change wasn't just in rules and policies, it was in people's hearts. During her advisory committee meeting, Sarah received an email that made her gasp. The State Department of Education wanted to use Riverside's program as a model for other schools. They were inviting Sarah and her fellow student leaders to speak at an upcoming education conference. "See what you started," Michael said, grinning as he read the email over her shoulder, "all because you refused to let Ms. Reynolds win." Sarah shook her head. "No, it's because we all refuse to stay silent. One person can start something, but it takes everyone to make real change." Later that afternoon, as Sarah wheeled through the hallways, she passed the school's main bulletin board. It was covered with photos from their campaign, including one of Dr. Grandin's visit. In the center was a new poster with a quote from Sarah's newspaper interview. "Change happens when we find the courage to tell our stories." She paused to look at it, remembering how frightened she had been on her first day of school. That scared freshman could never have imagined becoming a leader, inspiring others, and helping to create real change. But then again, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. And at Riverside High School, those changes were only beginning. As the school year drew to a close, Riverside High School had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The state education conference where Sarah and her fellow student leaders spoke had led to 20 more schools adopting similar inclusion programs. What had started as one student's struggle against discrimination had grown into a movement. On the last day of classes, Principal Garcia called a special assembly. The gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, and special guests, including representatives from the school board and local media. "When I became principal," he began, "I promised to make this school a place where every student could thrive. Thanks to Sarah Chen and her fellow students, we're finally achieving that goal." He announced that the school board had officially adopted new policies for all district schools, ensuring better protection against discrimination and mandatory training for all staff. The policies would be known as the Chen-Torres Protocols, named after Sarah and Michael. But perhaps our biggest announcement, Principal Garcia continued, is about next year's changes. Thanks to a grant from the State Education Department, we'll be building a new Inclusion Resource Center. And yes, Ms. Chen will be part of the planning committee. Sarah sat in her wheelchair, barely able to believe how much had changed since that first terrible day with Ms. Reynolds. She thought about all the future students who would never have to face what she did. After the assembly, there was a surprise celebration in the cafeteria. Students had prepared a video featuring interviews with classmates talking about how the Riverside United campaign had changed their perspectives. "I used to feel invisible," one student with autism said in the video. "Now I feel like I belong." "I never knew how to approach students with disabilities," another admitted. "I was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Now I understand that we're all just people." The video ended with a montage of news clips about their campaign, including Dr. Grandin's visit and the state education conference. Sarah was amazed to see how many lives have been touched by their work. Michael approached her after the video ended. "Remember when you thought you couldn't make a difference because you were just a freshman?" he teased. Sarah laughed. "Remember when you were just the quiet basketball player who sat next to me in English?" "Yeah, well, some things are worth speaking up for," he replied. The celebration continued with the unveiling of a new plaque that would hang in the school's entrance. It read, "Courage starts with one voice. Change happens when others join in. Riverside United, established 2024. As students signed yearbooks and said goodbye for the summer, Sarah received news that made her future even brighter. The state education department had offered her a paid internship for the summer, working on their inclusion initiatives for other schools. From being bullied by a teacher to advising the state education department, her mother said proudly, "You've come so far, sweetheart." Sarah looked around at her transformed school. The hallways where she once felt afraid were now filled with students of all abilities mixing freely. The teachers who had once seemed distant now actively participated in inclusion activities. Even the physical space had changed, with new ramps and accessible features being added regularly. As she prepared to leave for the day, Sarah found a letter in her locker. It was from a 7th grader at the middle school who had heard her speak at a recent event. "Dear Sarah," the letter read, "I use a wheelchair too, and I was scared about starting high school next year. But because of what you did at Riverside, I'm not afraid anymore. Thank you for showing me that our voices matter." Sarah carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her backpack. She thought about how one act of discrimination had led to something so much bigger than herself. Ms. Reynolds had tried to make her feel powerless, but instead, she had found her power and helped others find theirs too. As she wheeled out of the school for the last time that year, Sarah passed the bulletin board where her quote still hung. Below it, someone had added a new line, "And change continues when we help others find their voice too." Sarah smiled, knowing that while this chapter was ending, the story of Riverside United was far from over. Next year would bring new challenges and opportunities, but she was ready for them. After all, she wasn't just Sarah Chen anymore. She was Sarah Chen who helped change her school, her district, and maybe, someday, the whole education system. And that was a story worth continuing.